Once again, we're asked to logically complete the text, so let's just get a dumb summary of this passage, see if we can get some sort of main idea. It's very likely that the conclusion that we need is just another version of that main idea. So starting with the passage. The Indus River Valley civilization flourished in South Asia from 3300 BCE to 1300 BCE. Many examples of the civilization's writing system exist, but researchers haven't yet deciphered it or identified which ancient language it represents. So I'm going to kind of do some highlighting here. So there's many examples of the writing, but it hasn't been deciphered. Nevertheless, archaeologists have found historical artifacts such as clay figures and jewelry that provide information about the civilization's customs and how its communities were organized. The archaeologists' findings therefore suggest that, I don't know, this is something about the language. I don't know, the language or the writing. I don't know, something about the writing. I don't even know really where this is going. And this is the problem with some of these is there's lots of places where this could go. I understand though that they brought up that language and that writing system for a reason. It's probably going to matter. We didn't just randomly insert that and then we left that idea on the table. We're going to come back to it. So let's just see what we get from the choices. The findings suggest that investigating an ancient civilization is easier without knowledge of the civilization's language. Well, it definitely brings in the language, but why would it be easier without the language? That seems just not logical, just in kind of just my common sense. But also, that's a big claim. That's something we would need to have evidence of. It says that they found things, right? The word nevertheless is a good example of a transition word that kind of means we're going to ignore something that we said. We're going to say that it doesn't really matter that much, but it's not saying that it's completely irrelevant, right? So the fact that they don't know the language is maybe a barrier to understanding things. Nevertheless, there's still some things that they understand, right? They might not understand as much as if they did understand the language, but they still know lots of different things. So it's kind of dismissive of the language piece, but in a way that still acknowledges that it's an important piece of this puzzle. And so A is kind of saying that somehow the language thing is actually good, that they don't know the language, but that is not what we're saying in the passage. This is just kind of twisting the words too much. B, knowing an ancient civilization's language isn't necessary in order to learn details about the civilization. Well, I didn't come up with that conclusion myself, but now that I read it, I'm like, okay, that kind of sounds like what I was talking about, right? It definitely involves the language, and they did say that they don't know it, but they do know lots of other things, right? So right here is where they're kind of hitting on this idea that they did learn other details about the civilization. So this is plausible. This seems logical based on what we've talked about in the passage, but as always, let's continue, see if we can get any more. C, archaeological research should focus on finding additional artifacts rather than deciphering ancient languages. Well, the problem word here, the strong word that bothers me is the word should, a word that we would normally ignore. But this is telling me, this is like making an argument. But this passage isn't really making an argument. It's basically just presenting facts. It's not saying that they shouldn't look at this language. They shouldn't learn about it. It's just not what they're arguing. In fact, it's kind of very similar to A, because in both cases they're saying that this language thing is almost like a barrier, so that we need to just avoid learning the language for some reason. That doesn't make any sense. Again, it's not based on the rest of the passage. D, examining the civilization's historical artifacts has resolved the debate about this civilization's language. Well, no, they said that they don't know the language, so that's just kind of contradictory. But just as a larger point, strong words can fall into lots of different categories. This is one that involves the idea of proof or necessity. And if something is resolved, it's solved, right? The word solve is in there. So it's fixed, it's finalized. But it doesn't sound like they know everything they need about this civilization or the language, right? It sounds like they need to know more. And so even just without reading the passage, I would be very nervous about a choice like this because it contains such a strong word. So B is the best answer here. It's also kind of vague and weak, right? It's not saying whether knowing the language would be good or bad. They're just saying it's not everything, right? It's not all important to know that language to learn things about the civilization. And they don't explicitly say this in the passage, but you can see how those two ideas are basically hinted at in those two last sentences. So it's kind of what the main point of these questions is we're not necessarily going to be summarizing the passage. It's more that we are synthesizing the ideas and coming up with some sort of extra conclusion. And so it's still flowing from those ideas that we're reading, but it's not going to explicitly be said like it might in some other passages. That's what makes these a little bit harder, but at the same time, we're using the same strategy. We're going to think about dumb summaries and just kind of get the most basic versions of those ideas as possible, and then look for those ideas in the choices as well.